Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Stacy Sobel, Connecticut Regional Director of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. All of us remember the horror and tragedy of the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School on December 12, 2012. For those of us here in Connecticut, we watched as our neighbors in Newtown suffered the most painful and unimaginable losses. What we could never have foreseen was a frenzied distortions and conspiracy theory extremist that tormented the victims' relatives, accusing them of faking their own loved ones' murders. Tonight, we will present experts to explain how Sandy Hook has become a foundational story of how false conspiracy narratives and misinformation have gained traction in our society, and how this pattern of denial and attack has come to characterize some Americans' response to almost every major event, from mass shootings to the coronavirus pandemic, to the 2020 election, and to the violent insurrection on January 6th, 2021. I am very pleased and proud to welcome tonight Elizabeth Williamson, the author of Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy and Battle for the Truth. Elizabeth is a feature writer in the Washington Bureau and a former member of the New York Times editorial board. She has worked at the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and spent a decade as a foreign correspondent in Eastern Europe. Elizabeth's terrific book is based on hundreds of hours of research, interviews, and access to exclusive sources and materials as the Sandy Hook parents fought to defend themselves and the truth of their children's murders. Monty Frank is a Connecticut attorney, co-chair of the litigation department at Pullman and Comley. He represented the town of Newtown after the Sandy Hook mass shooting and represents business and municipal clients in the state and federal courts in Connecticut and before administrative agencies on a wide range of matters. Monty appears regularly on television, radio, and in the newspapers for his work on violence prevention. And Oren Siegel, Vice President of ADL's Center on Extremism, where he and his team combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Much of Oren's 21 years with ADL has been devoted to evaluating the activity and tactics of extremist groups from across the ideological spectrum, training law enforcement officers, and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. And with that, Oren, I pass the baton to you to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I really appreciate being asked to moderate this unfortunately timely but very important discussion. Thank you all for making the time to join us. As Stacy said, I'm Oren Siegel. I've been investigating and responding to extremism, hate, and the conspiracies that animate them for 20 years. In other words, I am not your motivational speaker today, but this is still a very important topic. I'm really excited to be able to speak with our guests, Elizabeth and Monty, to hear their perspectives and perhaps even by the end, help make sense of what is frankly all around us. Conspiracy theories are rampant in the United States and have an unusual power to motivate people to action. Some conspiracy theories are associated with various right-wing movements or left-wing ideologies, and many actually transcend ideology, like those surrounding 9/11 or the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Under the right circumstances, such theories can motivate people to violence, especially if those conspiracy theories single out specific people or organizations as villains. While our discussion today starts with the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, we know conspiracies are actually not new. And indeed, as Elizabeth so clearly outlines in her book, they are a staple of our time. So for example, in 2018, a Nevada man, Matthew Wright, triggered a brief standoff with law enforcement when he blocked a bridge at Hoover Dam with a homemade armored car. Comments by this individual after the incident suggested that his actions were motivated by a strange new conspiracy theory at the time. Now we know it to be QAnon. Conspiracy theories are dangerous because they are able to motivate people to action, especially if they can point to specific people, places, or institutions as being behind the conspiracies in question. This practice gives extremists, and frankly, a lot of non-extremists who just believe in these conspiracies, places to explore and victims to target. Look no further than January 6th. On that day, thousands of Americans gathered in DC, hoping to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election in a last-ditch effort to stop the current president from taking his space. That conspiracy, like so many others, seek to undermine the legitimacy of our democratic institutions. Look no further than coronavirus conspiracies. Millions of people continue to insist that the threat of the virus is being inflated or manipulated for nefarious purposes by the Jews, by a tyrannical government, by a whole host of others. These theories have inspired skepticism of public health recommendations, and hardcore believers of these conspiracies have targeted school board meetings, medical professionals, election officials. Again, it's not just our democratic institutions that are at risk, but the people who serve them are in the crosshairs. And finally, look no further than the Great Replacement theory, which alleges a master plan for people of color to replace white people through immigration, birth rates, or other economic, social, or political means, often at the hands of the puppet masters, which are described as the Jews. This conspiracy has found new life thanks to major media personalities like Tucker Carlson, like elected officials, including Representative Matt Gaetz, and a whole host of others. And do not forget that that particular lie has inspired several horrific acts of mass violence against people of color, Jews around the world in recent years, from Pittsburgh to Poway to El Paso Christchurch in New Zealand. So we are not dabbling in light topics during this conversation. Conspiracy theories are all around us and also enable people to double down and re-victimize the victims throughout this country. So to start us off, Elizabeth, thank you for being here, and tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book.
Thanks, Oren. I just wanted to start by saying it's a real honor to be invited by the Connecticut ADL to speak with everyone tonight. And, this is really the family's story and the story of people like Monty, who made heroic efforts to push back against this particular conspiracy theory, and in so doing, to push back against misinformation in general, which is so important. So I wrote the book because in the middle of 2018, when the first Sandy Hook families filed defamation lawsuits against Alex Jones, who is the Infowars impresario who magnified the theory that Sandy Hook was a hoax, that it was an event that never happened, and that it was something that was a pretext planned by the government. Someone just mentioned that my image is frozen. You'll probably experience that a little bit because I'm on the road for work. And so my internet connection is not what it would be if I were in my office or at home. So I apologize for that, but hopefully you can hear me. So the Alex Jones spread the theory that that Sandy Hook was an elaborate staged event planned by the federal government as a pretext for confiscating Americans' firearms. And the people, and it was an unusual conspiracy theory in that he targeted individual family members of the victims. This, even for him, was a departure. As you mentioned, there were other conspiracy theories around 9/11, around the Oklahoma City bombing, things like that, that did not target individual survivors or victims. And this was one in which, by name, he mentioned some of the family members. So they, in cases in Connecticut and in Texas, have sued Alex Jones in cases that are ongoing for the past 4 years. And in beginning to research these cases, I thought that this was an interesting test of the First Amendment's, the ability or the protection that it extends to people like Alex Jones and conspiracy theorists. They maintain that their right to free speech allows them to spread this hoax theory, which targets vulnerable people. And that I thought would be a very interesting test of whether or not they were right. But in talking with the father of the youngest Sandy Hook victim, Noah Posner, Lenny Posner is his father. He has a tech background, and he convinced me that, as Stacy said at the top, that this is a foundational story of how misinformation and disinformation spreads in our society. And you could follow a through line from Sandy Hook to most mass shootings, to QAnon, Pizzagate, to coronavirus myths, the 2020 Stop the Steal lie, and to the January 6th Capitol insurrection. So it became a much broader book as I went, because these same individuals, the same theories, the same motivations, and the same delivery methods recurred again and again as I researched the book. And so I thought that it would be a much broader work, and indeed it was.
Thank you for that. And this is just a reminder to those who are listening. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please put it in the chat and we will see that we can make time for it at the end. So Monty, can you take us through your background and your experience as counsel for the town in the aftermath of the shooting?
Sure. Thanks, Warren, and thank you, Elizabeth, for writing this incredibly important book, and for ADL for doing all the great work that you do and for promoting this event. First, is just a disclaimer. I take my role as counsel to the town very seriously, as well as my ethical obligations. I will not divulge any privileged information, any attorney-client privilege information. So when we get to the Q&A, I would appreciate if people are mindful of that. So I just want to start a little bit with my personal story. You know, as a kid growing up, I knew that my mother and my grandparents had survived the Holocaust. I know my family history. I have pictures of my family prior to the Holocaust, and most of the people depicted, my ancestors, were murdered. I took a class at Cornell as an undergrad, taught by Neil Shear, who was the director of the Office of Special Investigations. I heard firsthand from this real-life Nazi hunter who saw, and I saw evidence of the atrocities. And then I started hearing that there were those who denied that the Holocaust had even occurred. And of course, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, the internet, and crowdsourcing sites didn't exist back then. So the deniers essentially existed on the fringes of our society. And then I represented pro bono as part of Trial Lawyers Care, a man whose significant other died on 9/11. And I saw evidence of her life snuffed out way too early. I then heard the conspiracy theorists claiming Israeli and Jewish involvement in the attack. Now that occurred in 2001. Facebook was founded in 2004, and YouTube was founded in 2005. So by the time the Sandy Hook murders occurred on December 14, 2012, the world had changed. The way people heard news was different. And the power of social media was not only enormous, but it was not regulated in the same way that traditional media had always been. So in the aftermath of the murders at Sandy Hook, the town was inundated with media, visitors, donations of money and stuff, including something like 50,000 teddy bears and endless freedom of information requests, some from recognized media and others from private citizens. My first encounter with a hoaxer occurred shortly after the shooting outside the Edmond Town Hall, when a man walked up to me, and I was with a bunch of people. Clearly we were grieving, and started asking questions. Did you know any of the children? Did you know any of the family members? Did you know any of the police officers? And then this question turned ugly. Well, can you introduce me to them? Because I don't believe that it ever happened. And I just walked away. And to me, that was an eye-opening experience, and perhaps a preview of the onslaught that the town was going to experience, not over the next year, but literally over the next 9 to almost 10 years. We then started receiving requests from a man by the name of Wolfgang Halbig, and his 16 questions over and over again. We gave him invoices, receipts, meeting minutes, dash cam videos, and all he did was challenge their authenticity. He came to Newtown. We provided him with a conference room so he could review documents, a room to view the original dash cam videos. He showed up with his group and filmed it all, constantly grandstanding and playing to his growing audience. When we told him that certain documents either did not exist or that we did not have them, he kept asking for them nonetheless, over and over again. One of his repeat requests was for invoices for porta potties. Of course, the town did not have those records, but he would not accept that representation. He somehow thought that the delivery of the porta potties at the school on 12/14 was some sort of smoking gun supporting his conspiracy theory. He eventually filed appeals to the Free Information Commission, which provided him with an opportunity to not only to challenge the town's responses, but to broadcast his conspiracy theories around the world. Halbig's appeals were denied after many hearings, but that platform was vital to him. Infowars sent a camera crew to the hearings. I recall one instance where the reporter started chasing me, yelling, "There goes corruption." On another occasion, I was walking out with the chief of police, and the reporter was putting a microphone in our face, telling us that we're corrupt, that you're committing fraud on America, that you're going to jail. And then one instance after one of the hearings, Halbig was holding court with his supporters in the hall. And as I was leaving, he shouted the names of two girls. One, a living girl in Newtown, and the other, the name of a murdered girl he claimed that the two of them were the same. He then yelled at me, "You're protecting all those people? You're protecting them? And you're in the synagogue?" He is right in all respects. True, I did seek to protect living children and the honor of those who were killed. However, I did so as the town's attorney within the boundaries of the law. Halbig was going to get everything he was entitled to under the law and nothing more. It is also true that I was a member of the synagogue. I believe that the reference to the synagogue was because the living girl's father and I overlapped on the board of the synagogue for a brief period of time. And that's what they do. They take one fact from here, connect it to another fact somewhere else, and eureka, a theory is born. And they proclaim that theory to be the truth. Then they publicize it, they broadcast it, and they amplify it. Another example. At one point, there was a YouTube video posted about me claiming I was part of a conspiracy theory organized by the Obama administration to create Sandy Hook as a false flag in an effort to take away guns. The tie from the Obama administration to me was a person who worked in the administration who was a member of the Quill and Dagger Senior Honor Society at Cornell. I too had been inducted into the Quill and Dagger Honor Society at Cornell, but I didn't recognize the name of my alleged co-conspirator. So I looked him up and discovered that he had graduated from Cornell years before I had even arrived. Yet the fact that we were both in Quill and Dagger, irrespective of the timing, and regardless of whether we knew each other or communicated, was all that they needed to publish their fiction and present it as truth. Then one day, a new website appeared, www.montyfrank.com, dedicated to my disbarment and conviction for treason. Somewhat ironic in light of the later assault on the Capitol on January 6th, I might add. My initial reaction to the website was that it was better for the hoaxers to focus on me than the families. I really didn't mind being the lightning rod if they would leave the families alone. But then they started using the website as a platform to attack the families and post information about this Super Bowl choir theory that they were running with. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Lenny Posner ultimately got the website taken down. All of this was done to further a conspiracy theory that Sandy Hook was a hoax, that the murders did not happen, that parents and others, including me, were high-paid crisis actors, that we were engaged in a false flag operation to take away guns. Through social media and crowdfunding sites and a man named Alex Jones, the hoaxers gained fame, motivated supporters, and raised money. And Alex Jones did his thing. The net result was January 6th and beyond. I could go on, but hopefully I've given you a snippet of what dealing with the hoaxers was like, the vicious attacks, their tactics, the disbelief in fundamental facts, the different disinformation campaign waged, and the impact on the family and the communities. The net result is that conspiracy theorists no longer reside on the fringes of our society, but represent a way of thinking that is becoming more and more mainstream. And that worries me tremendously.
Thank you, Monty, for that. I'm sort of struck by the courage in telling that story. So really, really do appreciate it. Elizabeth, Monty talked about the power of social media and getting aggressive questions from disbelievers in person. Why was Sandy Hook such a lightning rod for these conspiracy theories? Is it social media? Is it something else?
So 2 reasons, Oren. As Monty touched upon, it was definitely the exponential rise in the use of social media by Americans at the time of the shooting. So just for basis of comparison, in 2007, the worst school shooting we've had in our history occurred, the Virginia Tech shooting in Blacksburg, Virginia. 32 people were killed in that shooting. I talked to the mother of a girl who was injured on that day, and I asked her, can you check your Facebook page? This woman, Lori Haas, was very active in the gun violence, the effort to combat gun violence in the aftermath of that shooting. She attended rallies across the country. She was pretty visible in that movement. And yet when she looked at her Facebook page, she said, I wasn't on it that much back then. And I really don't see anything. Nobody is accusing me of anything. But if you look at 2007 versus 2012, when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred, there were in 2007, 20 million global Facebook users. By 2012, just 5 years later, there were 1 billion Facebook users. Twitter was in its infancy in 2007. When Virginia Tech happened, there were 5,000 tweets a day. By 2012, there were 5,000 tweets every second. YouTube, which was a vehicle for a lot of this hoax material, there were 100 million videos viewed on YouTube a day in 2007, but just one video in 2012 gained 1 billion views. So that was definitely fertile ground for the spread of this hoax and for just the rapidity with which it propagated itself and spread around the world and attracted other people. As well, there were the algorithms that the social media companies used to drive more of this content to people who are interested in it. If you click on one conspiracy video, you will suddenly have in your feed many, many more. And that's how a lot of people started to come into the Sandy Hook hoax. The second reason that this was a kind of watershed was the fact that the shooting itself was so horrific that it was seen as an absolute moment for the gun policy debate by both sides in that debate. People knew that the shooting of first graders in such numbers and in such a horrific way, and the 6 educators who tried to protect them, was going to spark a very loud and emotional debate over gun policy legislation. And for some, like Alex Jones, who were vociferously against any new gun legislation, denying that the shooting happened became a tool in their toolkit.
So, Elizabeth, I want to just sort of follow up question with you before we go back to Monty. So it seems like Sandy Hook in some ways was sort of a blueprint of what we saw, right? Social media only continued to grow. the channels, the networks, the type of conspiracy theorists, and their audience grew massively. Crisis actor allegations were immediately found after the Parkland shooting, for example. And so in many ways, it was sort of rinse and repeat. And I think many people want to know, like, other than politics, why do so many people embrace this, right? It's almost one thing to understand why somebody might want to promote this for their evil ideas or financial benefit. Why do so many people buy into this?
So the answer to that was a real revelation to me when I was writing the book. With Alex Jones, there's a definite profit motive there. He sells tens of millions of dollars worth of merchandise to people who are interested in these types of theories, to people who are deeply distrustful of the government, distrustful of all government narratives or all official narratives. He sells, diet supplements to people who distrust traditional medicine, doomsday prepper merchandise to people who are, preparing for the end of days or the apocalypse, that type of merchandise. So for him, it's profit. But for most of the people who latched onto this theory and became really his content providers, because as Monty mentioned, they came up with their own ideas of, oh, well, I see this, this porta potty issue, Wolfgang Halbig, or the fact, we want to see receipts for who cleaned up the school. All of that became Infowars content. And people developed that online. There was a big Facebook group that Lenny Posner went into and actually tried to convince people otherwise. This was a group where hundreds of people gathered every night. And some of the earliest Facebook groups were actually around things like knitting and quilting. And so I sort of compare it to that. It was a group of people who gathered and they embroidered this fantasy around Sandy Hook, each of them contributing a new ripple in the plot, congratulating each other when they uncovered some new anomaly in the official reporting, building each other up. And they derived a lot of psychic income from this, a sense of social status. No matter what your position was in life, there was one woman who I profile in the book, Kelly Watt, who was a house cleaner in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who then became a citizen journalist and an investigator and a researcher who contributed a chapter to a book about the hoax called Nobody Died at Sandy Hook. People elevated themselves. It was a kind of aspirational thing for a lot of these people.
I'm struck when you say that. Recently QAnon supporters got together in Dallas and formerly Daley Plaza to believe that JFK Jr. is coming back, and you think to yourself, it's so absurd. And when we're sort of watching that as it happens, it just strikes me that there is like a real subculture that has been built. Like we all kind of want a sense of purpose and belonging. And for some, these conspiracies beyond, the facts offers a sense of, not being alone, right? And being able to not just connect with people, all around the world who share these beliefs, but literally come together on the ground. And I think that subculture element is something that can be very powerful and alluring to people as well.
For a lot of these people, it's almost an alternative family. Some of them, Wolfgang Halbig included, the man who made 24 trips to Newtown and pursued Monty Frank and, set up the website targeting Monty and also, other Newtown officials. This is someone who became estranged from his wife, from his children in his pursuit of this. These are people who choose this community even as their everyday lives sort of fall apart around them. It's a very powerful lure. It is a kind of enhanced status. It fulfills a psychological need. And, let's not forget also this idea that, paranoia is comforting in its way. So it's very interesting that some of the first people who doubted the facts of the Sandy Hook shooting were young moms who had children about the age of those who died in the shooting. And for them, it was just a form of, Lenny Posner compares it to, again, the Sandy Hook dad, father of Noah, the youngest victim, compares it to a form of PTSD that, we were traumatized as a nation by this shooting. And particularly people with children that age. And they were quickly convinced, but initially they were kind of there for anybody who could tell them that maybe these little children didn't die in this way. So it also points to that idea that there is a comfort in paranoia, because the alternative, I mean, this is Thomas Pynchon and Gravity's Rainbow, the alternative is a form of weightlessness, that, we can't predict anything, that random awful events happen. And, that's also functional with the JFK theory too, that how could, this president, beloved by so many people, have been assassinated by a lone gunman? It's so kind of random as to be traumatizing. And so people want to fill in that vacuum. But I would say that's also one of the most charitable explanations you can come up with, and definitely not the motivator for some.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So Monty, sort of two-part question. I'll start with, why does this conversation even matter? Like, why is it important for people to understand the tactics that you've experienced, that others in your community have experienced, and frankly, people around the country seem to be increasingly experiencing every day? Why is it so important to shed light on this, make what is invisible to some visible?
And Elizabeth and I have had this discussion, and I applaud her efforts so much, and I applaud what you all do at ADL so much for shining a light and exposing the hoaxers for what they are. I think both you and Elizabeth tonight and elsewhere provided thoughtful, knowledgeable, and factually based reasons as to why this discussion not only matters, but ought to concern every American. Or in your perspective, as someone who deals with extremism every day for years, is so important. And ADL's watchful eye over the proliferation of hatred and extremism must not only be recognized and appreciated, but all of us, whether we're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, whether we're part of the African-American community, Asian community, Arab community, or other minority groups that have been targeted, we have to join hands to fight this proliferation of extremism and hatred in America. Elizabeth, your perspective as a journalist and author is also so important. The book provides a very convincing, factually based demonstration of the through line from Sandy Hook to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol and beyond. Unfortunately, this campaign of disinformation and failure to recognize and accept facts continues and seems to be growing every day, and is getting more and more aggressive and more violent. And you see tones of it throughout our society, not just on the fringes, but from elected political officials. My perspective is slightly different, having lived through the attack on Sandy Hook and having been one of the targets of the vicious attacks. But I also have a deeper appreciation for this country and its democratic values and rule of law, all of which are under serious attack. Fundamentally, this cancer will continue to grow and destroy our country unless we can figure out a way to fight back against the disinformation campaigns. And so that's why this matters. It goes to the core of who we are as Americans and whether or not our democracy and the rule of law can survive.
If I could just jump in and add one more thing
Please.
to the really important comments, and that's that, this tendency toward defending these false beliefs with confrontation and with violence, as evidenced in the confrontation that Monty endured and the parents endured when people came up to them on the street. In researching the book, I could see this ratchet up over time. So 2016 was a really pivotal year in that 3 things happened that showed that this was starting to jump from the virtual to the real world. And people who believed these theories were starting to take action against the so-called villains in the plot, including the Sandy Hook families. But in 2016, that was when Lenny Posner, who again was at the forefront of confronting these conspiracy theorists and trying to hold Alex Jones and all these others like Wolfgang Halbig, James Fetzer, Kelly Watt, all the people who provided Alex Jones with this content, hold them to account, either in the courts or by trying to get this content taken down. In 2016, he received death threats that he reported to the FBI, and a woman went to prison for that. Also in 2016, a gunman showed up at, but not very far from where I live in Washington, D.C., at Comet Ping Pong, a pizzeria in a neighborhood full of kids, convinced that Democratic elites were trafficking children from the basement of that restaurant, which, by the way, doesn't even have a basement. So that was a precursor, a kind of, seminal story that became QAnon. And then also in 2016, across the country, thousands of miles from Newtown, Robbie Parker, whose daughter Emily died at Sandy Hook, was walking down a Seattle street, and I write about this in my book. A man came up to him. Robbie thought that he was going to offer his condolences, and instead he just spat these horrible accusations to him, telling him he was a liar and how much money did he make, and trailed him for blocks, confronting him in this way. So that year was a kind of watershed year for that propensity that we saw on January 6th of people who believe these false theories and this hoax content, willing to defend it in real life.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, just a couple of years later in 2018, we saw a lot of conspiracy theories talking about, caravans of, people from Mexico or other South American countries coming to invade, the United States. And one of the people who was listening to those conspiracies and animated by them, because some of them focused on, George Soros, who's the, Jew of the day, frankly, on many of these conspiracies as sort of funding these caravans. And the individual ended up killing 11 people at a Pittsburgh synagogue, was animated by those conspiracies. And we know that because we saw it in his writing, right? And his signaling back to the community before he did so. So it's just another example of the deadly consequences. And, one of the questions that we have in the Q&A, and thank you for those who have started putting them in, talks about working at a university and looking to explore programs that educate students on extremism and equip them with the skills to combat it. So I view that as like part of battling extremism is battling disinformation, conspiracy theories, etc. And so what can communities do, whether it's with students, whether it's other sort of tactics and strategies to protect themselves from conspiracies, whether they happen before something happens, or as we've seen, whether it's a doubling down? And this is a question to both of you. Maybe we can start with Monty.
Sure. So, if there is a tragedy that occurs in your community, and they seem to be more and more frequent, before that happens, make sure that you have your systems in place to deal with free information requests. And it includes funneling all requests through counsel. Second, you got to be skeptical of all requests. Try to understand who you're dealing with. And then, of course, you got to comply with the law. In Newtown, we were able to shut down the ability of Halbig continue to file appeals with the Free Information Commission because of a rarely used provision for vexatious requests. But it took a record and a long time to get there. I guess fourth, you need to understand that every filing and every hearing is an opportunity for hoaxers to broadcast to their networks and the world to seek to raise money and to provide content to the Alex Jones of the world. So you've got to be cognizant of that and aware of everything you say. I would recommend to all of you who are in states other than Connecticut that you should be looking at your state's freedom of information laws to make sure that they provide proper safeguards that balance the rights of citizens to obtain public records and take appeals against flat out harassment and vexatious requests. And I think the most important thing is we've got to get Congress to regulate social media sites. It's still the Wild West and provides a platform not only for the conspiracy theorists that we've been talking about, but as a method to galvanize extremism, violence, and insurrection. You know, if you look at what happened on how the events at the Capitol on January 6th were organized, it was on social media. If you look at what happened in Kenosha, there's a call to action on social media. There is no regulation of any significance on content. Lenny Posner, with two hands tied behind his back, has done an incredible job, but he can't do it alone. We're going to have to get Congress to act to make sure that the social media sites are appropriately regulated.
Yeah, Elizabeth, can I ask you to sort of answer that question as well, but also specifically on the part of, you know, is it unreasonable for users of social media to expect them to do more about this? What can an average user do to try to push back against this, considering so much of this is incubated in these online spaces?
I mean, at the micro level, I think what people can do is just practice a little hygiene on social media themselves individually. And here, you know, I think about, and I hate to put everything off to the younger generation, but here I notice, you know, I have kids who are very skeptical about what they consume on social media and what they post there. Much more so, I think, even than, you know, my generation or the generation, you know, directly beneath me. So I think that's one of the, you know, one of the big things that we can do individually. Second is to just push for some policy changes. It is a rare point of bipartisan agreement in Congress that something needs to be done to rein in the spread of disinformation on social media. It affects campaigns across the political spectrum, so that's an excellent motivator. Of course, there's enormous disagreement on what to do specifically, but there is a moment there for people to try and come up with a new policy. Right now, the social media platforms, as Monty said, they can act pretty much with impunity because they're protected by a section of the Telecommunications Act called Section 230, which grants them legal immunity for defamatory content that's spread on their platforms. So there are some creative efforts to rein in that immunity. One pretty elegant solution is one that if they are using their algorithms to spread this false and harmful content, they're using it to further their own business, and they should then therefore be held responsible for that content, rather than being treated as they are now as just the pipeline through which it flows. So that's one proposal. So I don't want to go on too long. I could go on forever about these potential solutions, but I see that we have more questions, so I'll leave it right there.
No, thank you for that. And you know, I mean, is it really unreasonable to expect that companies that are making billions and billions of dollars to put people over profits, right? In many ways, if they were, you know, spent as much time finding teams and algorithms to address and identify disinformation in this, they could probably do it. And one of the reasons I know, excuse me, is that, you know, we have a relatively small but mighty team at ADL that does this work, and we can find it. If we can find it, they can find it, and they can find it at scale and take more steps to protect their users and others who are impacted by it. So I have another question here from the chat. And it reads, right now we're seeing Roe versus Wade resurfacing. It is unknown how the leak occurred, but it seems possible entities wish to strike hard division and hatred in our society. What advice can you offer to people about this polarizing issue? How can we help prevent potential extremism. So I think, in other words, as we see, cultural issue after cultural issue that we know is going to be exploited by conspiracy theorists, is there a way to just sort of get ahead of it? I think, Elizabeth, you sort of mentioned hygiene, but that's sort of on your personal sort of social media. Are there other things that almost like, herd immunity from conspiracy theories and hate that we should be thinking about?
So one specific study that's being done, and an area of real progress. So there's a researcher, social psychological researcher named Sandra van der Linden at Cambridge, who has been pioneering some actual online games that people play that are intended to inoculate them against being quite as susceptible to conspiracy theorizing. So they're actually asked to design a conspiracy theory. So come up with all the elements, target an other kind of group, make it go viral, make it incendiary, all of these things. And the reason that they're being challenged to do that is so that people who are conspiratorially minded are then being shown how the sausage is made. So one of the reasons that people glom onto these theories is that they want to possess that sense. There's an element of narcissism there. They're possessors of superior knowledge, and they want to be that. So they'll use that sort of yen that these people have to say, hey, here's how this is designed. Here's how you're being taken in. And they're actually having real progress with that people who play this game, design the theory, figure out how it spreads, how it's created, tend to be more suspicious when they encounter theories online and more likely to report them. Because once someone is a conspiracy theorist and has embraced a conspiracy theory, it's really hard to pry them away from it. But if you can inoculate them ahead of time, that's much more successful.
It's really interesting. A study that ADL did with a partner organization called Moonshot looked at extremist spaces and non-extremist spaces and looked to sort of redirect them. What kind of, content that you can create that may, be able to sort of be a pathway out. But one of the results that organization found was that in spaces where they put mental health ads, in the extremist spaces, people were 40% more likely to click on mental health ads than in sort of non-extremist spaces, which to me suggests possibly that people actually want to find a different alternative to what they're believing, right? That there are other things at play here, right? So to the degree that we're sort of looking for hope, a study like that suggests that there may also be an area there. So I know that we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. And those of you who know me know I cannot just we can't just find the bad things and explain them. We need to find hope in these conversations. So maybe we'll start with you, Monty, go to you, Elizabeth. What are some of the bright spots in this grim landscape? What gave you hope, Monty, throughout this process that is also worth talking about?
Well, during the process, there wasn't a lot to be hopeful of, particularly as the years went on, and we were still getting inundated with requests, and the conspiracy theorists kept growing. And I think this goes back a little bit to the conversation we were having before, and there are two things that I would focus on. One is real community building, and for all minority communities, targeted communities, to unite. And there are good examples of that, where in Connecticut there was an attack on a mosque, and all of the faith groups came together and pronounced that attack on one faith is attack on the other. I know that when the Jewish community has been targeted in Connecticut, there's been a coming together of all faith groups to speak out against it. And I'm hoping the faith groups can continue to lead in that matter and preach from the pulpit and bring people together instead of what we're seeing in politics, where divisions are sowed and dividing people is rewarded. So, I'm hoping over time we will regain control of the political process, where things like trying to divide people is not rewarded, that we fix our broken politics and get back to solving the major problems that we face. That's a long haul, but I'm hoping it will happen one day.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Monty. Any positive thoughts, any bright spots, any hope, Elizabeth?
So yeah, I can't be anything but optimistic, and I'll tell you why. So the families shared their story, this terrible chapter, and people like Monty did too. I think because they have hope that, you know, that they believe in the system. After everything they've been through, they believe that the system works. That, you know, by telling their story, that people like, you know, who read it and understand it will get that they're sending up a warning and that they'll push to make some change. At a book event, someone asked me, "Are you more or less hopeless after writing this book?" And I said, I can't use hopeless as a baseline because the families aren't hopeless. They believe, they really believe that people like yourselves, like the ADL, like all the good people who are listening right now, will help, that they'll raise their voices and push for some changes from the social media companies, from members of their families who might be embracing these theories, from themselves, from their communities. This is not an insurmountable problem. The good news is we are all talking about it now. You know, this is much more prevalent and much more topical than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. And so with that concern, I think comes more and more ideas for change. And I do see that happening. And, you know, if the families can be hopeful and optimistic and pushing for this, how could we be otherwise?
Yeah. I just want to sort of echo the hope I get is from, you know, the courage that I see from people like you, Monty, and those in your community that are profiled in Elizabeth's book. I get hope from the team that I work with every day that spends, you know, almost every waking hour in the spaces where extremism and conspiracies and hate are amplified. And I also get hope from the fact, and I think, Elizabeth, this was it was great to hear you sort of say this, is that, you know, this moment in time is not going to be remembered only for the division and the hatred and the violence. But I truly believe it will be remembered for what good people did in the face of those things to push back. So really awesome to speak with you both. And Stacey, back to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It was really a pleasure and an honor to welcome you on behalf of ADL and bring these really important issues to light. And as Oren has said, ADL will continue always doggedly, tirelessly to pursue our mission of fighting hate for good. And with that, I'm going to end tonight with the words in Elizabeth's dedication page that say, no culture can rest on a crooked relationship to the truth. And so we move forward and fight for the truth. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.